this via QuickTime rather than Zoom. So we'll see if it works out because this is a little bit less clunky. So what we're going to talk about is Naming and Necessity, a paper by Saul Kripke. Okay, so Kripke is one of our own. He's a good American boy, born in Omaha, Nebraska, and he was a child prodigy. His father was a rabbi, and Saul taught himself ancient Greek ancient Hebrew, worse, at the age of 6, and then went on to do prodigy things until he graduated with a degree in mathematics from Harvard. So his most important work was in technical areas in the semantics for modal logic. And he is still around. I think he's now at Princeton, and he must be in his late 70s. Saul Kripke. Okay, so Kripke poses a problem. The problem is, how are contingent identity statements possible? Absolutely, everything that exists is necessarily self-identical, necessarily. So how can any identity statement be contingent? Nevertheless, there do seem to be some examples of contingent identities, apparently. First of all, consider the morning star, evening star problem that Frege posed, right? The morning star's name is Phosphorus, the evening star's name is Hesperus, and it seems that the identity, Hesperus is phosphorus, is contingent, could have been otherwise. Again, consider the next two identity statements. Heat is the motion of molecules, water is H2O. Now these are different in character from Hesperus is phosphorus, because Hesperus, phosphorus, these are individuals or an individual, whereas heat is the motion of molecules and water is H2O are theoretical reductions. In other words, we are characterizing a certain property, the property of being heat, the property of being water, as being, respectively, the motion of molecules and being H2O. Now, perhaps the most interesting identity statement that has been suggested as a contingent identity statement is the claim that mental states are just brain states. Now, this was a claim that was made around the time that Kripke was writing this article, very popular. It was known as the identity theory of mind, or central state materialism. And the idea is, look, if we want to be physicalists, if we want to reject the notion that there are non-physical entities, souls, spiritual substances, or whatever, kicking around, then what are mental states? Well, what explains our mental states? The way things are in our brain. So the claim, according to the identity theory of mind, as it's called, was that mental states are identical to brain states. Now, Kripke wants to claim that whereas this is his solution, this is it, whereas contingent identity statements are possible, contingent identity is not. And that's what we're going to spell out. And this seems like a trivial linguistic thesis. It just seems like so much philosophical trivia, but if Kripke is right, there are significant consequences. In particular, mental states, Kripke will argue, cannot be identical to brain states because all identities are necessary. And it's not plausible to hold that mental states are necessarily identical to brain states. Therefore, they can't, on Kripke's account, be identical to brain states at all. There are no contingent identities, even though there are contingent identity statements. So what's Kripke's argument? Excuse me. Mental states are identical to brain states only if that identity is contingent. And that seems so because we cannot plausibly hold that mental states are necessarily identical to brain states. It's plausible, right? It may be absolutely false, but it's plausible that mental states be something else, that they be states of spiritual substances, as Descartes suggests, and so on. So if mental states are identical to brain states, then that identity has to be contingent. But identity can't be contingent, as Kripke will prove, and we'll get to the proof later on. Therefore, mental states cannot be identical to brain states. So this looks like Kripke is pulling a rabbit out of a hat, but it's still a very plausible argument once we work through the theory that Kripke is going to develop. Shut up, Siri. Okay, so first of all, let's consider some of the conceptual machinery involved here, some of the concepts and some of the terminology that we're going to be working with in the course of this discussion. First of all, and we've talked about this a little bit before, the notion of possible worlds as a way of making sense of modality. That's to say, making sense of necessity, possibility, contingency, and the like. Now, on Kripke's account, we shouldn't press too heavily on this notion of possible world. We should understand possible worlds simply as a metaphor for talking about the ways things could be. Secondly, since what we're interested in here is a discussion of what's necessary, what's possible, what's contingent, and so on, we want to make sense of different ways of construing modality, different ways of construing possibility and necessity as de re and as de dicto. And I'll get into more about this. I'll go through these concepts in more detail one bit at a time. But the idea here is that de dicto literally means about what is said, whereas de re means about the thing. So we're making a distinction between, in the case of possibility, the way things could be in and of themselves, and the way we can talk about them. So I'll get back to that. Finally, one of the terms that Kripke introduced, and I'm pretty sure that he was the one that actually introduced this terminology, is the notion of a rigid designator. A term, a piece of language, is a rigid designator, a referring expression, if it refers to the same thing at all possible worlds. And once again, there will be more on this. Finally, we distinguish some properties of objects as accidental. These are properties that an object has but could fail to have and still exist. And other properties as essential. So essential properties are properties that an essential property of an object is a property that the object necessarily has. It's a property that it couldn't fail to have without ceasing to be. Okay? And the view is that some properties are essential. Some properties are such that the objects that have them necessarily, regardless of how those objects are described. And this thesis is the thesis of essentialism, which Kripke endorses. Okay, so first of all, the first of the concepts, possible worlds. As I said, we understand a possible world as a way things could be. We use the term actual world as a metaphor for talking about the way things actually are. Okay, and we're going to talk about possible worlds to explain modal notions like logical possibility, necessity, and contingency. And I repeat once again that Kripke regards possible world talk as metaphorical for talk about what he sometimes calls counterfactual situations. Situations that are not the case, but could be the case. Okay, ways things could have been. Okay, secondly, the distinction between possibility de dicto and possibility de re. Okay, so here's an example. Here's a sentence. The number of planets around the sun is necessarily even. Now, that claim is ambiguous. It can be understood in two different ways, de dicto or de re. If we understand it as de re, then we understand it to say the number of planets, namely 8, is necessarily even. And that's true because numbers are necessarily what they are. An even number is necessarily even. So if we construe the sentence, the number of planets around the sun is necessarily even, as de re, as saying something about the number 8, then it's true. Okay. On the other hand, suppose we understand it to mean that it is necessary that there is an even number of planets. Well, that's false. In other words, understanding it de dicto in that way gives us a false statement because it's a claim about the world, not a claim about numbers, but a claim about planets. And it's false because there could be any number of planets, odd or even. It's logically possible that there could be any number of planets, odd or even, going around the sun. Okay, let's consider some other cases. De re and de dicto necessity, and cases in particular where a statement is de dicto necessary but de re not. How about the author of Hamlet wrote Hamlet? Now, de dicto, that's certainly necessary because in general, if an individual is the author of Hamlet, which is to say, wrote Hamlet, then that individual wrote Hamlet because any statement of the form if P, then P is necessarily true. So, de dicto necessary. But it's not necessary de re because it's not the case that there's a guy of whom it is necessarily true that he wrote Hamlet. Shakespeare might have not written Hamlet. So this is just another example to give you the flavor of the distinction between de dicto and de re. Okay, how about a case where we have de re necessity, but not de dicto necessity? And here we go with the morning star and the evening star. It's not necessary de dicto that the morning star is the evening star. We identify the morning star as the first heavenly body seen from Earth in the morning, and the evening star as the first heavenly body seen from Earth in the evening. And it could be that the first heavenly body seen from Earth in the morning was not the first heavenly body seen in the evening. Okay, it's possible. But if we construe that claim de re, right, then we're construing it to say the morning star is Venus, the evening star is Venus, and that object, Venus, aka the morning star, aka the evening star, is necessarily self-identical. And that's true, because everything, planets included, are necessarily self-identical. So once again, just another example to give you the flavor of that distinction, which I think is a pretty intuitive distinction between de dicto and de re, and the ambiguity that it introduces into identity statements. Okay, so identities and identity statements. Kripke does have a proof, which I will get to eventually, that purports to show that necessarily everything is self-identical. But not all identity statements are necessary because the terms that figure in an identity statement don't necessarily refer to the same object. In fact, what Kripke is going to argue, and this is why he makes such a fuss about names, right? Why he makes such a fuss about talking about Hesperus and Phosphorus rather than the morning star and the evening star. He's going to claim that where identity statements involve names rather than definite descriptions or other kinds of referring expressions, then they are necessary, because names, he will hold, are rigid designators. So that's why he's fussing about names. Okay. Okay. So not all identity statements are necessary because the terms that figure don't necessarily refer to the same object. For example, the identity claim, Mark Twain is identical to the author of Huckleberry Finn. Well, de re, right? Mark Twain is necessarily identical to himself. But the author of Huckleberry Finn might have referred to somebody else. Someone else might have written it, right? So the identity statement is contingent in spite of the fact that Mark Twain is identical to himself. Okay, now this brings us to Kripke's terminology, rigid designators. A rigid designator is a referring expression that picks out the same object at every possible world in which it exists. So on Kripke's account, proper names, for example, Donald Trump, are rigid designators, regardless of how things were right? Whatever possible world we're at, Trump would be Trump and can't be anyone other than himself. However, definite descriptions, for example, the President of the United States, are not rigid. Someone else could have been president. Somebody else could have occupied that position or played that role. At some other possible world, possibly Hillary Clinton got elected. At some other possible world, maybe I got elected. Okay, so we're distinguishing between proper names and other referring expressions. Now, finally, regarding essential properties. An object's essential properties are those it couldn't fail to have, properties it has necessarily, which it couldn't lose without ceasing to exist. Now, what these essential properties are, that's controversial, and Kripke gives some examples, but the idea here is that an object's essential properties are properties of it, not properties of the way it's called, of what it's called, how it's referred to. There are some properties, of course, that are clearly not essential. Sometimes we call those properties accidental. For example, my being a philosopher is not essential to me. I could have chosen a different career path. Essentialism, in any case, and this is a view that Kripke is defending, is a view that there are essential properties that things have, regardless of how these things are described. Not merely a matter of language, in other words. Okay, now more on modality, possibility, and necessity, because the possible worlds account of modality purports to explain de re modality. So to say a state of affairs, some individuals having some property F, is logically possible, is to say that that claim is true at some possible world. A proposition X is F, saying that X has some property F, is necessarily true if it's true at all possible worlds. A proposition X is F is contingently true if it's true at the actual world, or the world that we're considering to start from, but false at some other possible world. So that's how we define possibility and related notions in terms of possible worlds, or ways things could have been, could be, could become. Because remember, Kripke holds that possible worlds talk is metaphorical, just a shorthand way of talking about ways things could have been, could be, or could become. Okay, now recall, we talked about this last time, the distinction between those statements that were a priori, knowable prior to experience or apart from experience, and those propositions which were a posteriori, okay, or empirical. We talked about that. And Kripke warns us about something. He notes that a priority, and a posteriority are epistemic concepts. They concern how we know things, whereas necessity and contingency are metaphysical concepts. They concern what makes something the case. So we can ask, right? This poses a question. Are all and only a posteriori, are all and only a priori propositions necessary? And are all and only a posteriori propositions contingent? Well, Kripke holds, and he gives examples, that there are contingent a priori propositions, and also that there are necessary a posteriori propositions, and we will come to some examples presently. Now remember what pre-Kripkean orthodoxy was about, how things lined up. On one side, there were those propositions that were analytic, true in virtue of language alone. And of course Quine questions this, but lining them up, analytic propositions were taken to be necessary. Since they were true in virtue of language alone, nothing about the world could make any difference. So what that meant is they were true in all possible worlds. Regardless of what the world was like, analytic propositions would be true. Moreover, on this orthodox, pre-Kripkean orthodox account, they were a priori. since nothing about the world makes a difference, we don't need to know what the world is like. We don't need to know what world we're at in order to determine the truth of these propositions. On the other side, we had those propositions that were synthetic. On this orthodox account, these were contingent because their truth value was contingent on the way things were at a given world. And, contingent in the non-philosophical sense ordinarily means dependent. And that's why I think we talk about such propositions as being contingent, because their truth value is dependent. It's dependent on the way things are outside of language. It's dependent on the world we're in, so to speak. Okay. And these propositions could only be known on the basis of experience, on our experience of that world. So to know whether they were true or false, we would have to make observations to determine what the world we're at is like. Okay, so this was the standard view prior to Kripke. And you can see this in air. Okay. Now, to repeat once again, Kripke questions this because he points out that necessity and contingency are metaphysical notions. Quote, by calling a statement necessary, we simply mean that it is true and could not have been otherwise, contingent if it could have been otherwise. Whereas a priority and a posteriority are epistemic notions concerned with how we can come to know whether a statement is true. Okay, so because these are they're apples and oranges, they're two different kinds of notions, right? It may be, and this is what Kripke argues, that they don't line up in the way assumed by pre-Kripkean orthodoxy. Okay, so Kripke has an unorthodox answer that upsets the old apple cart that lined them up in two columns. Okay, some a priori propositions are contingent. How can that be? Which one? Which ones? Well, one of the examples, and I don't think he cites it in this particular article, but it's one that's standard, which he cited elsewhere, concerns the standard meter rod in Paris. Now, this is a standard that was set, I suppose, in the late 18th century when the notion of measurement when there was an attempt to redefine notions of measurement for convenience and for scientific purposes. So they wanted a standard unit of measurement for length, and they established the meter. And the meter was defined, believe it or not, as 1/1,000,000th the distance between the North Pole and the equator. Okay, so they measured it, and they got a rod, right, which had that length, which had the desired length. And they put it under glass so nothing could interfere with it. It wouldn't get hot, it wouldn't get cold, it wouldn't expand or contract. And the standard that set was the standard for anything counting as a meter. Now, do we know that the meter rod, that standard meter rod, is exactly a meter in length? Sure, because that's what it is to be a meter in length, to be as long as that meter rod, and that meter rod is as long as itself. How do we know it? Did we have to investigate? No, it's because the very definition of meter is the length of this meter rod. So here's a case where we know something a priori, but which nevertheless is contingent because a different rod could have been chosen. A different standard could have been chosen. So this is one of the examples given of contingent a priori. Okay? How about necessary a posteriori? In other words, propositions that are necessary, but which we could only determine by empirical methods. Well, heat is molecular motion, and this Kripke will worry. He will talk about it considerably. There is one of the paradigm examples of a posteriori, necessary but a posteriori. Okay. Now, how can this be? Okay, well, let's consider some of these examples in more detail. Contingent a priori and necessary a posteriori. Let's see how I'm going for time. I'm doing okay. Okay, there, by the way, is a standard meter rod. And it looks like it's sitting next to the standard liter bottle, and it's next to the standard gram weight. So the idea is all this stuff is under glass, and this sets the standard for measurement. Okay, so rehearsing this once again, I know a priori that the standard meter rod is exactly 1 meter long because I know that being the length of the standard meter rod is just what it is to be 1 meter long. And this is only a contingent fact. The standard would have been different if some other rod had been selected. So it's contingent that any given object is a meter in length because a rod that was different in length could have been selected. Wow, I get pinged. Okay. Okay, here's another case. Neptune, the planet, causes perturbations of the orbit of Uranus. And here's a word where, whichever way you put it, it sounds bad. Is it your anus or is it Uranus? Okay, leave that. We won't go there. Okay, perturbation, a disturbance in the orbit or motion of a heavenly body due to the attraction of the various other members of the system on each other. Now, before Neptune was discovered, it was noted that Uranus was behaving badly. Okay, it was behaving in such a way that suggested there was some other planet yanking it around. So it was hypothesized that there was such a planet, and the planet that did the yanking, okay, whatever it was called Neptune, right? So in a way, just as the standard meter rod is whatever it is that we use as a standard for measuring meters, Neptune, right, was initially described, right, as whatever it was that was yanking Uranus around. So whatever it was that caused those perturbations was Neptune. Now, what that means is that Neptune necessarily was what caused those perturbations because it was simply understood as whatever did that job. So here's another example. And here's yet another example that's a little bit different because it involves indexicals. Remember, indexicals are words whose reference depends on context of utterance. That's to say, on who says it, in the circumstances in which it was said, where it was said, when it was said, and so on. And these include words like I, here, now, this, that, and so on. So here is Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. Cogito, let's see, can I get a pointer? Pointer. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And Descartes says, this is something I can be certain of, absolutely certain. I can be certain that I'm now thinking. Well, how can I be certain of it? Well, because my very thinking about it, right, putting that proposition to myself is itself thinking. So necessarily, whenever I say I think, I'm thinking. So there are some funny statements like that, which appear to be necessary. And finally, here's Kripke's own example, which he talks about some, the lectern example. So here's a lectern, and it's made out of wood. And Kripke holds that this very lectern, this very object, which we know a posteriori, because we've examined it, was not made of ice, necessarily was not originally made of ice. So he goes to that example in some detail. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't become made of ice. Suppose little bits of the wood are taken away and replaced with little bits of ice and the whole thing is in a big freezer, right? If they were gradually replaced that way, it could become made of ice. But that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that it could not originally have been made of ice, even though there could be another lectern in the same place that looked just like it that had been made of ice. This very one could not have been made of ice. So Kripke's claim is that not having been made of ice is an essential property of this lectern. Now, this is a controversial claim that has been spelled out in a variety of other cases, known as necessity of origin. The claim is that things could not arise from different sources than the sources from which they originally arose. And you can think of this in cases of persons or any animals, right? Could I, the person that I am, have come from a different fertilized ovum? Now, some claim that I couldn't have. It would have been a different individual. But this claim of necessity of origin is one of the claims that Kripke cites as an example of a case of a posteriori but necessary. Okay. Here's another one. Heat, molecular motion, which I'll talk about a lot. Now, that's not something we could figure out a priori, but Kripke will claim that it's necessary. And similarly, water is H2O, and we'll talk about that in more detail, particularly in the discussion of Hilary Putnam's piece next time. Okay, now we didn't know that this stuff was H2O for many, many millennia. We only identified it as H2O after a lot of investigation, a posteriori investigation, but we knew what it was. We knew it was water. We knew what water was before we knew that it was H2O. We knew it. So it's not a definition. It's not something that's analytic when we say water is H2O. Okay, so this gives you an idea of Kripke's claim that we can pull apart the notion of a priori from the notion of necessary, and we can also pull apart the notion of a posteriori from contingent. Now, as I say, it's important to his view that he makes a distinction between names and other sorts of referring expressions, because he is going to hold that names, ordinary proper names, are rigid designators. And this is also an unorthodox view, or a view that was, when he was writing this, highly unorthodox, because it was diametrically opposed to the orthodox view, and this is a view that comes from Russell and Frege, that names were disguised descriptions. So we're going to compare Kripke's causal theory of naming to the description theory that is generally tagged on Russell and Frege. Okay, back to rigid designators again. We know what they are. And the claim is, Kripke's claim, is that ordinary proper names are rigid designators. Now, contrast this with Russell's view. Remember, the only real names, according to Russell, the only mere tags, according to Russell, are things like this here now. In other words, expressions that refer to one's immediate sense data. But on the account that Kripke endorses, ordinary names are tags in that sense, contrary to Russell's view that ordinary proper names like the king of England or Apollo or whatever are disguised descriptions. So remember, when Russell talks about Apollo, what does the name, how do we understand the name Apollo? Well, look it up in the classical dictionary, right? It gives you a long description. The twin brother of Artemis, the sun god, all that stuff. Contrary to that, Kripke holds that ordinary names are mere tags. And the claim is that identity statements in which objects are referred to by names, right, are necessary. So necessarily, Saul Kripke is identical to Saul Kripke. And necessarily, Saul Kripke is not identical to Willard Van Orman Quine. Now, you may worry about this because you might say, but couldn't people have different names? Couldn't things in general have different names from the names that they actually have? I mean, imagine thinking of the actual world. Here in the actual world, this guy says, my name is Saul Kripke. But he could have had a different name. He could have been named Willard Van Orman Quine. So there's a possible world in which he bears that name. But that isn't to say that he is identical at any world to Quine. It's just to say that he has a different name, because this guy, Kripke, is this guy, even though at this other possible world, he has a different name. So in saying that Saul Kripke, that term, as we use it, is a rigid designator, we mean that the name as we use it in our actual world language refers to the same individual at all possible worlds, including worlds in which that very individual has a different name. So Kripke couldn't be Quine, even though he could have been named Quine. Okay, so that's a subtle point, but the idea here is that changing something's name doesn't make it a different object. Okay, there's a riddle that's ascribed to Lincoln, right? And the riddle goes, if you call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? And I've taken surveys on it, and some people say 5, and some people say 1, a tail, right? But Lincoln's answer was 4, because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it 1, and calling Kripke Quine doesn't make him Quine, doesn't make him a different individual from the individual he is. Again, let's talk about numbers, and this is Kripke's example. In the actual world, we have a symbol system, right? We have a language of numerals. And in actualese, the language that we talk in the actual world, 9, this thing, right, means this many. Okay? So the square root of 81 equals 9 in actualese is a true statement. But imagine another possible world where we have a different symbol system where this numeral, pronounced 7, means this many. Well then, in possibilese, the language that they talk at this other possible world, the square root of 81 equals 7. But that doesn't mean that the mathematical truth collapses when we go from world to world. We cannot say, Kripke says, that the square root of 81 might have been a different number from the number it in fact is, for that number has to be just 9, whatever we call it. We have to distinguish numbers, whatever they are, from their names, numerals. Okay, so let's continue on with names, and as I say, according to the description theory, the Russell Frege view, a name refers to an object in virtue of the object satisfying the description associated with that name. And this is a view that Kripke rejects, the disguised description view, and he proposes an alternative. Okay, so the description theory is really the if the shoe fits, wear it theory of names. Names attached to objects according to the description theory by carrying descriptions or having senses, remember Fregean senses, that uniquely describe them. And this theory was modified because some suggest, and I think this was Searle's suggestion, that we don't have to have a complete uniquely referring description associated with a name. We just have to have a cluster of various descriptions, and the object in question has to satisfy just some significant number of them, or the central ones, in order for the description to pick out that object. But one way or another, this was a description theory of reference, where the idea was that what made a name attach to an object was the thought, right? The thought that we had, the descriptions that we understood that name to be associated with. On Kripke's account, by contrast, ordinary proper names are mere tags. They don't have senses. They don't convey descriptions. They just pick out. Now, how do we attach names to objects if it's not via descriptions? Well, on Kripke's account, we confer them on objects by tagging, sometimes also called baptizing or dubbing. We just attach the name. Sometimes, however, when we aren't around to dub, we can tag something by means of a description that fixes the reference. So take the way the reference of Neptune was fixed. Whatever it was that causes perturbations of Uranus' orbit is what Neptune is. That's how we fixed the reference. Or Hesperus, aka the evening star. How did that get fixed? Well, people saw a heavenly body that appeared as the first heavenly body in the evening, and they fixed the reference of that name, Hesperus, in that way. But one way or another, by tagging or by description, right? Names in question do not have sense. They're mere tags. And therefore, to refer to an object, we don't have to know the description that fixes the reference. And in fact, the object to which we refer doesn't need to satisfy the description that we might have used initially to fix the reference. Because suppose the Hesperus, Venus or whatever, suppose, and this is Kripke's example, gets yanked around so that it's no longer the first heavenly body seen in the evening. Well, it's still Hesperus, even though it no longer satisfies the description by which the reference of its name was fixed. Okay. So, reference fixing descriptions are not the senses of names or descriptions that they disguise, and that's worth underlining. I can successfully use a name to refer to an object, even if I have no idea of the description, if any, by which the reference of the name was fixed or how the tagging happened. So, for example, take the name Mark Twain. Do you know how he got that name? Okay. He took that name himself as his pen name. In any case, once the tagging is done, those names are passed down in the linguistic community via a causal chain, hence the causal theory of naming, a causal chain going back to the tagging or the reference fixing. Okay? So this is an externalist theory. What makes the name stick, right, isn't that it somehow corresponds to something going on in our heads, our understanding certain sorts of concepts. What makes the name stick is an external state of affairs where the tagging occurred and then the linguistic community picks up the name and passes it down generation to generation. Okay, now let's go back to complete this picture to further discussion of modality de dicto and modality de re. Okay, now here's a claim. Necessarily, the President of the United States is a politician. Now, this is true de dicto, since the presidency is an elective government office, and I take it that by definition, anyone who occupies an elective office counts as a politician. But de re, if we take it as de re, it's false, because read as de re, it says of this individual, it says of Donald Trump, that this guy had to have taken up politics, which he didn't. Okay? Now, the de re, de dicto distinction figures not only when we're concerned with modality, necessary, impossible, but when we're concerned with propositional attitudes. For example, belief statements involving belief, desire, and the like. So take this one. Once again, George believes that the tallest man in the room is a professional basketball player. Now, that also exhibits the de dicto, de re ambiguity, because de dicto, we construe it as meaning George believes that whoever the tallest man in the room is a professional basketball player. Suppose he's in a room of people and he's told one of the people in this room is a professional basketball player. And a number of them are 5'2", 5'4", et cetera, and one guy is 7 feet tall, right? So he's going to believe that whoever the tallest man in the room is, he just knows that he's heard that one guy in the room is 7 feet tall, the tallest man in the room, and he believes that whoever that person is a professional basketball player. Read as de re, however, the claim is that George believes of a particular individual who happens to be the tallest man in the room, that man is a professional basketball player. Okay. Okay, and now essentialism again. The notion of modality de re, which we've been talking about, commits us to essentialism. The view is that there are properties that an object must have and cannot lose without ceasing to exist. And that's about the object. It's not about the way the object is described, right? It's not like saying a politician is necessarily a politician, or saying that anybody who's president is a politician. That's necessary because that's what it is to hold an elective office. No, it's saying of the individual, not the way the individual is described, that it necessarily has some properties. Okay? So, what kinds of properties have been proposed as being de re essential to an object? Well, being president is not essential to an individual, to Donald Trump, for example, but there might be other necessary properties that he has de re, quite apart from his description, like not being a mosquito or not being a Bank of America credit card account. And that example it's always entertained me of an impossible state of affairs. My being a Bank of America credit card account comes from Nathan Salmon, who is now he's on the faculty at University of California, Santa Barbara. But it's a striking example, and it seems to be a plausible example of an essential property of a human being, namely not being a credit card account. So essentialism is the view that objects have essential properties in this sense. Okay, and as I said, one of the controversial features, or one of the controversial doctrines that some hold, necessity of origin, says this lectern could not have been made of ice. Wouldn't be the same lectern if it was. Okay, and similarly, some want to claim that another person exactly similar to me could have originated from a different fertilized ovum, but that individual would not have been me, because necessarily I originated from that particular, the word that Graham Forbes uses is propagule. I could not have originated from any other propagule or seed. Okay, and then of course there's water, etc. And the notion is that natural kinds, what does that mean, a natural kind? Okay, well, sometimes we classify things relatively arbitrarily. For example, can opener. Anything that opens a can is a can opener. But there are some classifications which seem to be rooted in nature. They cut along the joints of the natural world. For example, elements like gold, okay, substances like water, okay. And the claim is also that natural kinds, in this sense, have real essences. And in the case of water, the essence of water is being H2O. Okay, now, Kripke argues that whereas identity statements may be contingent, identity as such, as a de re notion, is necessary. Everything is necessarily identical to itself. And how does the argument go? At last, Kripke says, okay, symbols. But let's read through it and see what this is the way Kripke puts it. So let's read through it and see what this argument actually says. Okay, so the first claim says, for all x and all y, if x is identical to y, then whatever f you choose, if x is f, then y is f. Okay? If x is identical to y, then whatever property x has, y has, and vice versa. Probably should have been a biconditional. Okay. Next. Okay, you buy that. It seems like we can buy that because if things are identical, they're the very same thing. They aren't things, and everything has the same properties as itself. Next. For all x, by the way, this is the symbol for necessarily. You read it as necessarily. It's a modal operator. Okay? So what this says is for all x, necessarily, x equals x. In other words, necessarily, x is identical to itself. Okay. Everything is necessarily identical to itself. That seems pretty safe, right? Next. I need a parenthesis here, sorry. For all x and all y, if x is identical to y, then necessarily x is identical to x implies necessarily x is identical to y. Okay, how does that work? Okay, well, if x is identical to y, and if x is necessarily identical to x, then y is necessarily identical to x. In other words, let's think about what those properties are. What are those f's? Okay, well, one of those properties is being necessarily identical to x. Okay? Now, if x is identical to y, then y is going to have all the same properties that x has, including the property of being necessarily identical to x. That's the key here. Now, if you buy that, right, because remember, once again, being necessarily identical to x is a property, right? Whatever is identical to x has to have that property of being necessarily identical to x. Okay, conclusion. For all x and all y, if x is identical to y, then necessarily x is identical to y. So that's how we get necessity of identity. And that argument is valid. Okay, and 4, remember, is de re, right? It's saying something about this particular object, which we designate as x, which we designate as y. Okay, it just says that everything is self-identical. Now, Kripke makes a point of saying 4 does not say anything about statements at all. It says that for every object x and object y, if x and y are the same object, in other words, if the identity claim is true, then it is necessary that x and y are the same object. Okay, so we got necessity of identity, and it's proven. But then, what about statements? How, given that identity is necessary, de re, how can we have contingent identity statements? Well, the idea here is that identity statements can be contingent because the referring expressions they include may pick out different objects at different possible worlds. Okay? And they can do that if they aren't rigid designators, that's to say, if they aren't names. So, for example, consider definite descriptions. Consider referring expressions like the first postmaster general and the inventor of bifocals. Now, as a matter of empirical fact, the first postmaster general was indeed the inventor of bifocals. It was Benjamin Franklin. But this identity is contingent because those two referring expressions are not rigid designators. They can refer to different individuals at different possible worlds. Could be like this. As things are with us, this guy, right, was the first postmaster general, and he invented bifocals, right? So the statement, the identity, the first postmaster general, is identical to the inventor of bifocals. That's true. But there's another possible world. We can imagine a state of affairs in which this guy was the first postmaster general, and this guy, Jefferson, wouldn't put it past him because he was always experimenting with stuff, was the inventor of bifocals. And at this possible world, the statement, the first postmaster general is identical to the inventor of bifocals, would have been false. But that doesn't mean that Benjamin Franklin was not identical to Benjamin Franklin. It doesn't mean that at this world he was not self-identical. It just means that the terms pick out different individuals because they're not rigid designators. Okay, now let's come to the hard cases where it looks like we have identity statements that do involve rigid designators, that involve names, but which are nevertheless contingent. And there's Hesperus is phosphorus, and there's heat is the motion of molecules. Well, Kripke is going to argue that these are not really contingent, that the supposed contingency of these claims is an illusion, and the result of our confusing notions like necessity with notions like a priority, because these are statements which can only be determined a posteriori, but which are nevertheless necessary. So their contingency is an illusion, the result of confusing a posteriority with necessity. A posteriority with contingency. Okay, so go back to necessity and a prioriticity. Probably should be a priority, I don't know. Okay, The illusion of contingency comes from confusing necessity and a prioriticity. Okay. And Kripke's claim is that both of these identities, the Hesperus-phosphorus identity and the water is H2O identity, while they're a posteriori, are nevertheless necessary. Okay, now we go back to reference fixing again. Remember, we can fix reference via a description, right, that enables us to tag. But reference fixing does not describe the object in question. It's not the sense of the term that we use to pick out the object. So we fix the reference of Hesperus as the heavenly body first seen in the evening, and we fix the reference of phosphorus as the heavenly body seen in the morning. That's the way we fix the reference. But the names themselves are just tags. They don't have any sense. They don't mean the heavenly body first seen in the evening or the heavenly body first seen in the morning. That was just a means for tagging them. Okay? And the names themselves are just mere tags. So, and then once again, this is Kripke's example. Suppose a comet yanks Venus away, so that Mars is the heavenly body first seen in the evening. Well, that doesn't make Hesperus refer to Mars, even though now Mars satisfies that description. Okay? Still tags Hesperus, still tags Venus, aka Hesperus, and not Mars. Okay? Okay. So it could be that the heavenly body, think of the comet yanking around Venus, it could be that the heavenly body we see in the morning is not the same as the heavenly body we see in the evening. It could be. It's epistemically possible, but it's not metaphysically possible, so to speak. Okay? Now, we can't know whether the heavenly bodies we see in these two circumstances are the same a priori. That was an empirical discovery. But nevertheless, necessarily, not a priori, but necessarily, Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. Okay, so the contingency is an illusion here. Now, let's go to theoretical reductions, like Kripke's paradigm example, heat is the motion of molecules. Okay, this is a posteriori, but according to Kripke, necessary. Now, to make this out, it's important to distinguish heat, right? Heat itself, from its effect on us, from the sensation of heat. The sensation which comes for us from touching hot things. Now, what Kripke claims is that heat is the motion of molecules at all possible worlds. Okay? Even possible worlds where heat doesn't produce the sensation of heat at all. Because it's certainly conceivable that there be such possible worlds. For example, there could be completely unpopulated possible worlds where there are no individuals that have sensations. Or there could be worlds where there are individuals that experience heat very differently from us. So enter the Martians, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a piece by David Lewis on this very issue, on mad pain and Martian pain. Now, in the case of these hypothetical Martians, they experience heat very differently from the way we experience heat. To them, the sun feels cold. Heat causes them to feel the sensation that we identify as cold. So it's not necessary that heat, whatever it is that the sun produces, right, causes the sensation of heat. Okay, heat itself is the motion of molecules. Kripke goes on. We use both terms heat and the motion of molecules as rigid designators for a certain external phenomenon. So it's going to be necessary that heat is the motion of molecules. Don't confuse that phenomenon, heat, with its effect on us, with the sensation that we get from it. What gives us the illusion of contingency is the fact that we have identified the heat by the contingent fact that there happen to be creatures on this planet who are sensitive to it in a certain way. Okay, so contingency here too, as with Hesperus phosphorus, is an illusion. Okay. It's contingent that the sensation of heat is caused by the motion of molecules. It is not, however, contingent that heat is the motion of molecules. Okay, we mustn't confuse the sensation of heat with heat itself. Now, this gets us to the payoff here and Kripke's critique of the identity theory of mind. Remember, the identity theory of mind, also called central state materialism, was the view that mental states were just brain states. And Kripke is going to argue that this fails. Okay, so what about this mental state, brain state identity? The example usually given is pain is identical to the firing of C fibers. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but firing of C fibers is just hypothetical brain state, right, which is associated with pain, whatever it is. And the identity theory claims that pain is identical to that brain state. And this is the view, the person that Kripke cites is U.T. Place. And I've always wondered what UT stood for, but UT Place and Jack Smart and David Armstrong, a number of people who are writing at this point were endorsed this kind of identity theory. And on their account, let's just look at Place. The identity was supposed to be a contingent identity analogous to the claim that heat is the motion of molecules. Okay? But the problem here is that, as Kripke has argued, the claim that heat is the motion of molecules only seems contingent because we confuse heat with a sensation of heat. And it's only contingent that the sensation of heat is associated with heat. Okay? It's contingent that the sensation is associated with the thing, with heat itself. Okay? So we ask, is the mental state, brain state identity really analogous to the heat molecular motion identity? Well, to argue for that, we would have to show that pain is necessarily the firing of C fibers, and that the illusion of contingency arises from our confusing the sensation associated with the pain and pain itself, because we would pick out pain contingently on this account by the fact that pain affects us in such and such a way. But wait a minute, this is very strange, because what is pain if not a sensation? What is pain if not the sensation of pain? So while we can distinguish heat from the sensation it causes in us, doesn't seem to make any sense to distinguish pain from the sensation it causes in us, because pain is that very sensation. Pain hurts. Pain necessarily hurts. And if it doesn't hurt, it ain't pain. So that's where the analogy fails. Okay, so pain is essentially painful. Pain necessarily hurts. And Kripke continues, both the terms my pain and my being in such and such a brain state are rigid designators. One cannot say that this pain might have been something else, might have been some other state. And because pain and brain state pick out their objects essentially, we cannot say that where you seem to imagine the identity statement false, it's really an illusion, like the illusion one gets in the case of heat and molecular motion. The analogy fails. Okay, so we've got to reject the mind-brain identity theory. Now, this is tough, right? Because we want to, or at least many people want to be physicalists. They want to hold that I am nothing but my body, or more particularly, that I am nothing but my brain, and that my mental states are nothing but, are just identical to brain states. What else could they be? But what Kripke has argued here is, look, first of all, okay, if this is an identity, it's got to be a contingent identity, right? Mental state, brain state identity has got to be contingent. because we can certainly conceive of, we can certainly imagine states of affairs in which people are disembodied. There are many, many thought experiments. People imagine this all the time. Descartes imagined this. Okay? Well, it's got to be contingent if it's an identity, but there are no contingent identities because Kripke has proven it. So we are going to have to reject the identity theory of mind, or else modify it to make it more or less unrecognizable. So if Kripke has succeeded in showing this, it would be an apocalyptic conclusion. And the question I leave you with is, has he shown it? Now, wrapping this up, I have a Kripke worksheet up, and it's up at the website, and you can take a look at it to review. And next time I go through next lecture, I will try to start off by going over the worksheet. So pick it up, do the best you can, send it in so that I can get feedback to see where people are at. And next time I will wrap up Kripke, and we will talk about the article that follows, and that touches on some of the same themes, the article by Hilary Putnam. So keep well, be safe, and I will see you then. Now let's see if I can turn this thing off. Off.